Why did the 19th century's explosion of wealth, a period of unprecedented industrial and technological advancement, simultaneously create the most brutal, widespread, and systematic poverty the world had ever seen? This was the central paradox of the Industrial Revolution, a time of stark, unavoidable contrast that defined a new age. In cities like Manchester, London, and Berlin, new factories, powered by steam and ingenuity, choked the skies with black smoke, generating fortunes that dwarfed those of feudal kings, while, in the same city, epidemics of cholera and typhus, born of filth and overcrowding, ravaged the new working-class districts. This was the age of Michael Faraday unlocking the secrets of electricity and Charles Darwin formulating the theory of evolution. Yet it was also an age where life expectancy in some industrial quarters fell below that of the pre-industrial era. This new world of laissez-faire capitalism, celebrated by economists like Adam Smith for its liberating power, created a desperate, landless working class, the proletariat, who had migrated from the countryside, only to find themselves virtual serfs to the machine. They were crammed into overflowing, unsanitary tenements, with families sharing single rooms, while diseases like cholera and typhus ran rampant through the overcrowded, poorly ventilated districts. Children, some as young as 5, were forced into brutal 16-hour workdays in textile mills and coal mines, their small bodies ideal for crawling under active machinery, their bodies broken before they reached adolescence. This wasn't the cyclical poverty of a bad harvest. This was a new, man-made poverty, structural feature of the very system that was generating immense, concentrated wealth for a tiny minority of factory owners, bankers, and industrialists. This chasm between the opulence of the few and the desperation of the many, this grinding, dehumanizing reality of life at the bottom, set the SEO for a radical, explosive idea that would not just critique this new world, but would seek to tear it down and build a new one from its ashes. This is the kind of critical turning point in history that we are dedicated to exploring in depth on this channel. If you find this exploration of the figures and ideas that fundamentally shaped our modern world to be valuable and engaging, we would be deeply grateful for your support. Please take a vital moment to press the like button underneath this video. It is a small click for you, but it makes an enormous difference in helping our content reach a wider audience through the YouTube algorithm. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and, just as importantly, clicking the notification bell right next to it. By doing so, you ensure that you will never miss one of our future documentaries, deep dives, or analyses. Finally, the best way to support a channel like ours is to share this video with a friend, a family member, or on a social media platform where you think others might appreciate this kind of historical context. Your engagement and your support are the fuel that allows us to continue this work, and we thank you profoundly for being part of this community. Born in 1818 in the ancient city of Trier, and part of the Kingdom of Prussia, Karl Marx was the son of a successful lawyer and descended from a long line of Jewish rabbis. However, to escape anti-Semitic laws that barred Jews from professional careers, his father Heinrich had converted to Lutheranism, a fact that imbued the young Marx with a certain sense of being an outsider, a skepticism towards established religion and state authority. He was a brilliant, if unruly, student of philosophy, first enrolling at the University of Bonn, where he spent more time accumulating debts, writing romantic poetry, and even engaging in a duel than he did in the austere lecture hall. His exasperated father soon transferred him to the far more serious and intellectually rigorous University of Berlin. It was here that Marx's world was turned upside down. The intellectual atmosphere was electric, dominated by the legacy of the great philosopher Hegel. Marx fell in completely with the young Hegelians, a radical group of students and intellectuals who were obsessed with Hegel's work. Hegel's philosophy was complex, but at its core was the dialectic, the idea that history moved forward through a clash of opposing ideas, a thesis, its antithesis, and their resolution in a synthesis. The establishment Hegelians saw this process as culminating in the perfect Prussian state. The young Hegelians, however, led by figures like Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach, read Hegel in a revolutionary way. Feuerbach's work The Essence of Christianity argued that God was merely a human projection, an idea that electrified Marx. They didn't just want to interpret the world. They sought to turn Hegel's idealist philosophy, which stated that ideas shape material reality, completely on its head. Marx would come to argue the opposite, that material, economic conditions are the base that shapes all of reality, including our ideas, politics, and religion. He completed his doctorate, but, as a known radical, was denied an academic career. He turned to journalism, becoming editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, where his fiery articles criticizing the state's treatment of the poor, particularly his reporting on new laws that criminalized peasants for gathering fallen wood. A traditional right pushed him from liberal idealism toward a full-blown critique of private property, and soon got the paper banned by the censors, forcing him into exile. At the same time, Friedrich Engels was living a shocking, profound double life. Born in 1820 in Barmon, Prussia, he was the eldest son of a wealthy and deeply pious Calvinist factory owner, the owner of a successful textile mill. Engels was a sharp, critical mind from a young age, chafing under his father's strict religious conservatism, and developing a lasting disdain for the very bourgeoisie class he was born into. He was sent to Manchester, England in 1842 to work as a clerk at the Erman and Engels Victoria Mill, the family's enterprise. His father's intention was to season his rebellious son in the ways of business and perhaps cure him of his radical leanings. The effect was the absolute opposite. Manchester was the shock city of the Industrial Revolution, the white-hot core of the new capitalist world. Engels, by day, was a respectable bourgeois gentleman, engaging in the pastimes of his class like fox hunting and attending soirees. But by night, he explored the city's hidden, horrific underbelly. He was guided in this endeavor by Mary Burns, a young, working-class Irish woman who became his partner, his lover, and his indispensable window into the true cost of industrial capitalism. She and her sister Lizzie took him into the unlit, unpaved alleys of the Irish and Little Dublin slums, past the open sewers and the reeking piles of offal, and into the cramped, windowless cellars where families starved. He wasn't just observing poverty, he was witnessing a systematic process of human degradation. This first-hand, visceral reality, a reality that haunted him and fueled his moral outrage, led him to write one of the most powerful works of social investigation ever published, his 1845 study, The Condition of the Working Class in England. It was not a dry academic text, but a passionate, data-driven indictment, meticulously documenting the squalor, the pollution, the 16-hour workdays, the rampant child mortality, and the sexual exploitation that were the direct products of his own class's pursuit of profit. In August 1844, at the famous Café de la Régence in Paris, a smoky haunt for the city's intellectuals and chess masters, the two men met for the second time. Their first encounter had been brief and unimpressive. The connection this time was electric. Marx, having been exiled from Prussia, was in Paris, then the revolutionary capital of Europe, editing a radical journal, and had just published his economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. In these Paris manuscripts, he developed his crucial theory of alienation, the idea that under capitalism the worker is estranged from the product of his labor, which he doesn't own, from the act of labor itself, which is forced and repetitive, from his own human nature or species being, his potential for free, creative work, and from his fellow human beings who become competitors. Engels, passing through Paris on his way back to Germany from Manchester, sought Marx out. They began talking, and legend has it, did not stop for 10 days. It was an intellectual explosion, a perfect fusion of two minds. Marx had the sweeping philosophical framework, the deep training in Hegelian dialectics, and the incisive revolutionary critique of philosophy itself. Engels had the real-world evidence, the empirical data. The smoking gun from the first hand, lived experience in the very heart of the industrial beast in Manchester. He brought the concrete to Marx's abstract, giving his philosophical theories a brutal material grounding. They discovered, to their astonishment, that they had independently arrived at the exact same conclusion: that history was not driven by God's kings or abstract ideas, but by material, economic forces, and that the agent of the next great historical change was not a group of philosophers, but the new, impoverished, and property-less industrial working class, the proletariat. This meeting was the beginning of one of the most famous and consequential collaborations in history, a fusion of intellects that would weaponize theory for the explicit purpose of global revolution. Immediately, their collaboration began to bear fruit, and their first order of business was to intellectually clear the decks. They had to define their new worldview not just in opposition to the conservative state, but also in sharp opposition to their former radical colleagues. Their first major joint work, The Holy Family, 1845, was a dense and ferocious polemic aimed squarely at their old friends, the young Hegelians, particularly Bruno Bauer. Marx and Engels now saw their former comrades as insufferably arrogant idealists content to engage in critical critique, a form of abstract philosophical wordplay while remaining detached from the real material struggles of the working class, whom they dismissed as the unthinking masses. This was followed by the German ideology written in 1845–46, a text so radical that it found no publisher and would not be discovered and printed until 1932, long after both men were dead. It was in this manuscript that they truly hammered out the foundations of historical materialism, decisively breaking with Feuerbach, who they felt had stopped short. It was here they famously declared that consciousness does not determine life, but life determines consciousness, and the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. This was the first clear articulation of the base and superstructure metaphor, that the economic base, the forces and relations of production, determines the legal and political superstructure laws. Government, art, religion, philosophy, they were moving beyond mere philosophy and into a comprehensive theory of history, economics, and social change. They were defining their enemy. It was not just a set of bad ideas. It was the entire system of private property, the division of labor, the bourgeois family structure, and the political state that existed to uphold and defend this system at all costs. Their ideas were no longer meant for the academic salon. They were designed as weapons for the streets. Their ideas, having been forged in theory, now moved decisively into the realm of practice. Marx and Engels became deeply involved with the burgeoning, clandestine networks of exiled workers and radical artisans that populated cities like Paris, Brussels, where Marx had moved, and London. These were secret societies in the truest sense, with codes, rituals, and a revolutionary fervor born of desperation. Many were influenced by utopian socialists like Fourier or Cabet, or by the conspiratorial insurrectionist ideas of figures like Auguste Blanqui, who believed a small secret vanguard could seize power on behalf of the masses. One of inkiest, the League of the Just, was a group of exiled German artisans, mostly tailors and woodworkers, who held utopian, almost quasi-religious beliefs in a kind of communist brotherhood. Marx and Engels respected their revolutionary spirit, but were deeply critical of their conspiratorial, cult-like nature and their lack of a coherent scientific theory. They didn't want a small cabal plotting in secret. They wanted a mass, open, international political party with a clear set of principles, one that understood the economic laws driving history. Over a period of months, they engaged in intense debate and political maneuvering, systematically winning over the League's leadership to their new materialist worldview. In June 1847, the League of the Just held a congress in London. They agreed to reorganize, abandoning their old secretive structure and adopting a new, democratic one. They renamed themselves the Communist League, and crucially, they changed their old, vague slogan, "All men are brothers to the new," militant, class-conscious slogan proposed by Marx and Engels, "Workers of all lands unite." Following the London Congress, in November 1847, the newly christened Communist League held its second Congress, also in London. This time both Marx and Engels were in attendance and played a dominant role. The League, now fully convinced of their scientific socialism, formally and publicly asked Marx and Engels to write a definitive platform, a document that would clearly and forcefully lay out the League's principles and aims for the entire world to see. Engels had already produced a draft, structured as a 25-question and answer catechism, titled Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith, which he later reworked into Principles of Communism. This format was common for political groups at the time, but both men felt this was too dry, too academic, too static, and too limiting for the task at hand. They needed something with fire, something with rhetorical force that would resonate far beyond their small circle. A text that could be read aloud at workers' meetings. Marx, returning to his study in Brussels, took primary responsibility for the final text. He procrastinated, as was his notorious habit, absorbing and synthesizing their decade of shared thought into one explosive document. By January 1848, the League's Central Committee in London had grown justifiably impatient, sending Marx an ultimatum that was part plea, part threat, giving him a firm deadline of February 1st and warning that measures would be taken against him if he failed to deliver. Spurred into action, Marx locked himself away and, in a furious burst of intense creativity, penned the manuscript. The result, published in German just a few weeks later, was the Manifesto of the Communist Party. It began not with a dry thesis, but with one of the most famous and rhetorically brilliant opening lines ever written. Spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. The manifesto's core idea, the engine driving its entire analysis, was historical materialism. In the manifesto's own uncompromising words, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. This single idea reframed all of human history not as a story of great men or divine will or competing nations, but as a relentless, ongoing conflict between social classes over the means of production. It posited a sequence. The communistic tribes of prehistory gave way to the slave-owning societies of antiquity, master versus slave. These collapsed into the feudalism of the Middle Ages, lord versus serf. And feudalism was itself violently overthrown by the rising merchant class, the bourgeoisie. Objectively, it defined two great, opposing, and modern forces that had been created by this process. First, the bourgeoisie, the new ruling class, who owned the means of production, the factories, the land, the banks, and the machinery. The manifesto actually praised the bourgeoisie as a historically revolutionary force that had accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It had overthrown the old feudal order, created more massive and more colossal productive forces than of all preceding generations together, and in its relentless pursuit of profit, had created a truly global market. But in doing so, the manifesto argued the bourgeoisie had also forged the weapons that bring death to itself, and, more importantly, had it called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletariat. The proletariat was defined as the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. The manifesto argued that this conflict was the final, simplified class antagonism, one that would inevitably intensify until the proletariat, conscious of its own exploitation and its collective power, would rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, seize the means of production, establish a new classless society. Published in London in German in late February 1848, the manifesto's timing was nothing short of explosive. The ink was barely dry on the first copies when days later, a massive popular uprising erupted in Paris, forcing King Louis-Philippe to abdicate and proclaiming the Second Republic. This was the spark that lit the fuse. Within weeks, a massive, continent-wide wave of revolutions, what would become known as the Spring of Nations, erupted across Europe like a string of firecrackers. The news, traveling by the new telegraph, inspired one uprising after another with shocking speed. Barricades went up in Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Milan, and Prague. The old monarchical order of Europe, which had seemed unassailable for centuries, seemed to be collapsing overnight. It was an astonishing, world-shaking coincidence. The pamphlet itself, which at that point had only been read by a few hundred German exiles, was certainly not the cause of these spontaneous and complex uprisings, which were driven by a potent mix of nationalism, liberalism, and sheer hunger. But as the chaos spread, the ideas contained within the manifesto suddenly seemed less like abstract theory and more like chilling, immediate prophecy. It provided a ready-made language and a powerful analytical framework for the revolutionaries on the streets. Marx and Engels themselves, galvanized by the news, immediately packed their bags and rushed back to Germany, settling in Cologne. There, they founded a new radical newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, with Marx as its famously domineering editor-in-chief. He used it as a platform to agitate relentlessly, not for an immediate communist revolution, which they deemed premature in Germany, but for a radical unified democratic republic and a revolutionary war against Tsarist Russia, which he saw as the great bastion of European reaction. The Spring of Nations was a bloody failure. By 1849, the counter-revolution had triumphed. The revolutionary movements, plagued by internal divisions between liberals and radicals, between different nationalist groups, were systematically and brutally crushed by the regrouped forces of the aristocracy and the military. The liberal bourgeoisie, having achieved some gains, quickly grew terrified of the more radical demands of the proletariat they had mobilized and promptly betrayed them, siding with the old order. The Prussian monarchy reasserted its control, and Marx, having spent his inheritance funding the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, was charged with incitement to revolt. Though he was acquitted by a sympathetic jury, he was immediately expelled from Prussia as an undesirable alien. He fled to Paris, believing the revolutionary potential was still alive in France, was promptly banished from there as well. In August 1849, stateless, penniless, and with a pregnant wife, he crossed the English Channel and settled in London, the one place in Europe that would grant asylum to political refugees. This was the beginning of what he called his long, sleepless night of exile. He and his family were plunged into an existence of extreme, soul-crushing poverty. They lived in a cramped two-room flat in the squalid Soho district, hounded by creditors and dodging landlords. Sickness was a constant visitor. Marx himself was plagued by painful carbuncles and liver ailments, exacerbated by his poor diet, lack of sleep, and constant stress. The conditions were so dire that several of his children, including his beloved son, Edgar, died from diseases related to malnutrition and poor sanitation, a devastating personal tragedy that brought the conditions of the working class viscerally into his own home. He survived only on small, infrequent journalism fees, most notably as a European correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune, and crucially, on the constant, generous, and unwavering financial support from his friend, Friedrich Engels, who had with great personal reluctance returned to his family's cursed and highly profitable cotton business in Manchester. Nearly every day for the next 30 years, Marx would make the trek from his Soho flat to the magnificent domed reading room of the British Museum. This became his sanctuary and his laboratory. Having seen the revolution fail, he became convinced that it was not enough to simply agitate. He first had to understand the capitalist system on a profoundly scientific level, to dissect its inner workings, its contradictions, and to discover the laws of motion that governed it. He embarked on a monumental course of research, devouring hundreds of books on political economy, history, statistics, and government reports, the Blue Books, which provided a detailed official record of the very exploitation he sought to condemn. He filled thousands of pages with dense, spidery notes, cross-referencing economic data with philosophical insights, building his argument brick by painful brick over decades of relentless study. The result of this life's work was Das Kapital, a critique of political economy or capital, with the first volume being the only one he would live to see published in 1867. This was not a short, fiery pamphlet like the Manifesto. It was a vast, dense, sprawling, and ferociously academic dissection of the capitalist system itself. It begins not with revolution, but with the commodity, a simple object, like a coat or a yard of linen, which he analyzed as the basic cell of the capitalist world. He introduced the concept of commodity fetishism under capitalism. The social relationships between people, the exploitation of the worker by the capitalist, are masked, appearing instead as objective relationships between things, the price of the coat. He meticulously analyzed how this system generated profit, introducing his core concepts, the labor theory of value, the idea that the economic value of a commodity is determined by the average socially necessary labor time required to produce it, and most importantly, surplus value? He argued that the capitalist's profit came from paying the worker not for the full value of their labor, but only for their labor power, the cost of keeping them alive, i.e. their wage, thereby extracting unpaid surplus labor. This surplus value, he argued, was the engine of capital accumulation and the source of the system's explosive growth. Its inherent crises and, in his view, the seeds of its own inevitable destruction. The role of Friedrich Engels in the creation of this body of work, and in the survival of Marx himself, simply cannot be overstated. He was not merely a wealthy patron who funded his friend's research. He was an indispensable intellectual collaborator and a crucial emotional support. While living in Manchester and running a business he despised, Engels not only provided the constant stream of money that allowed Marx to pay his rent, feed his family, and dedicate his life to writing Das Kapital, a task that would have been utterly impossible otherwise, but he was also his most trusted sounding board and sparring partner. Their vast correspondence shows them debating complex economic theories, historical events, and political strategy. Engels, a brilliant intellectual in his own right who authored foundational works like The Origin of the Family Private, Property and the State, and Anti-Düring, which did more to popularize Marxism than many of Marx's own writings, was Marx's second fiddle, as he humbly called himself, but he was a second fiddle with the talent of a virtuoso. His most profound contribution, however, came after Marx's death in 1883. Marx died at his desk, a man broken by illness and the recent deaths of his wife, Jenny, and his eldest daughter. He left behind a mountain of chaotic, disparate, and barely legible manuscripts for the planned second and third volumes of Das Kapital. It was Engels who took on this colossal, thankless, and monumentally difficult task. It was an act of profound intellectual and personal loyalty. For the remaining 12 years of his own life, he painstakingly deciphered Marx's notoriously awful handwriting, cross-referencing, drafts and marginalia, editing the drafts, organizing the material, and ultimately constructing and publishing volumes 2 and 3, ensuring that his friend S. Life's work would survive and be presented to the world as a coherent, finished system. The manifesto's ideas, once published, were adapted, and in the view of many historians and political theorists, fundamentally altered by various 20th-century political figures and movements, most notably by Vladimir Lenin and later by Mao Zedong. This adaptation and reinterpretation led to the creation of state ideologies, primarily Marxism-Leninism, which served as the official, political and economic doctrine for nations such as the Soviet Union following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, the People's Republic of China following the 1949 Revolution, and numerous other states in Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa. For the purposes of this educational documentary, it is crucial that we analyze these 20th-century state ideologies as distinct historical and political phenomena. Separate from the original 19th-century writings of Marx and Engels, Marx had predicted that revolution would occur in the most advanced industrial capitalist countries, like Britain or Germany, where the proletariat was largest. Instead, it took root in the vast agrarian quasi-feudal empire of Tsarist Russia. This required a significant adaptation by Lenin, who argued that a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries was needed to lead the undeveloped working class. Later, Mao Zedong adapted it further for China, basing his revolution not on the tiny urban proletariat, but on the massive, impoverished peasantry. The implementation of these ideologies in practice involved the creation of single-party authoritarian states, the state-led collectivization of agriculture, and the establishment of centrally planned economies. As is required for any balanced and objective historical analysis, we must state clearly and unambiguously that these 20th-century regimes are the subject of intense historical scrutiny and are documented by historians as being responsible for widespread political repression. The systematic suppression of dissent, the creation of forced labor camps such as the Gulag, and periods of catastrophic state-induced famine and loss of life. We do not condone these outcomes. We are presenting this information for its clear and necessary educational context as we analyze the political adjustments of the 20th century. Objectively, Marxist theory, both in its original form and in its 20th century applications, has faced decades of intense and sustained scrutiny from virtually every field of study. economists, particularly from the Austrian schools such as Eugene in the 19th century, and later Ludwig von Mises, launched a foundational critique, arguing that the labor theory of value is fundamentally flawed. They proposed instead that economic value is not objective based on labor time, but entirely subjective based on an individual's personal marginal utility or preference, a critique that, if accepted, unravels Marx's entire theory of surplus value and exploitation. Economists also pointed to the transformation problem, a complex technical issue in Marx's work concerning his inability to coherently translate the values of commodities based on labor into the prices of production that are actually observed in the market. Philosophers of science, most famously Sir Karl Popper in his 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, challenged the very concept of historical materialism, or historicism, as unscientific. Popper argued that Marx's theory of historical inevitability, the idea that capitalism must collapse and be replaced by communism, was not a falsifiable scientific prediction, but a dangerous, unfalsifiable prophecy. Because the theory could never be proven wrong, any event, even one that contradicted the prediction, could be reinterpreted after the fact as part of the process. It was, in his view, a pseudoscience. Moreover, Popper argued that this belief in a predetermined historical destiny provided a powerful and perilous justification for totalitarian methods, licensing revolutionaries to sweep away all opposition, legal rights, and individual liberties in the name of achieving an inevitable future. Finally, and perhaps most powerfully, historians analyze the grim authoritarian outcomes of the 20th century states that explicitly claim the banner of Marxism-Leninism. The documented realities of Stalin's Great Purges, the Holodomor in Ukraine, the Gulag Archipelago, Mao's Great Leap Forward, and the subsequent famine, and the killing fields of Cambodia are all analyzed by historians as catastrophic failures of 20th century authoritarianism, which used this ideology as its justification for absolute power. So, decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, events that many proclaimed as the end of history and the final, definitive death of Marxism, why are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels still two of the most discussed and debated thinkers in the world? The 2008 global financial crisis, catastrophe that began in the heart of Western capitalism and exposed the system's profound fragility, brought Marx's name roaring back into the mainstream. Suddenly, his core critique of capitalism not as a stable, perfect endpoint, but as a dynamic, unstable and crisis-prone system seemed astonishingly relevant. His analysis of the system's inherent tendency to concentrate wealth in fewer and fewer hands, creating vast, untenable gulfs of economic inequality, felt less like 19th century polemic and more like a description of the 21st century's 1%. This was reinforced by works like Thomas Piketty's 2013 book Capital in the 21st Century, which used modern data to show that the rate of return on capital was again outpacing economic growth, just as Marx had observed. Today, contemporary debates about the precarity of the gig economy, persistent wage stagnation, even as corporate profits soar, the crushing weight of personal debt, the growing power of an unaccountable data bourgeoisie who own and trade our personal information, a phenomenon known as surveillance capitalism, and perhaps most profoundly the looming specter of mass unemployment as automation and artificial intelligence threaten to make human labor obsolete. All of these modern anxieties echo the fundamental questions about the relationship between capital, labor, and human dignity that Marx and Engels first raised over 150 years ago. While their specific answers, a violent proletarian revolution and a state-controlled dictatorship of the proletariat, have been rejected by most of the world for both their theoretical flaws and their devastating historical applications, their fundamental diagnosis of capitalism's inherent contradictions, its instabilities, its crises, and its generation of inequality continues to resonate with its undeniable and uncomfortable power, proving that these two ideas, for better or worse, are very far from dead, continuing to challenge and provoke us to this day.